start on time. I know there are more people who will join. We might only be at our half-hour capacity at the moment, but more people will join as we go through. Welcome to you all. Welcome to, once again, to some of our aged care facilities. I'm going to do what I always do, nothing personal, but at this point in time, I mute everyone in a way you can't unmute yourselves. Mr. Raphael, Aron, and we might give you another name shortly. We're going to unmute you if that's okay, because you'll sound so much better during the interview if you can be unmuted. So at the moment, you should be able to click on unmute. The others, unfortunately, at this stage can't. I can see you struggling there. And Tuffy, can you click on unmute? Oh, yes, that's it. Yeah. It has worked. Thank you very much. Welcome to you all. Thanks very much for coming.
You have a lot of control over here. This is
That's right. By the way, I should try this at home on my wife. It doesn't work. So thank you very much to all of you joining today. I'm worried she's probably listening to this. And yes, we are recording at the moment. I've had a request that we're recording at the moment. These are, by the way, recorded and uploaded to YouTube. There's only one that will not be recorded. That's on the 3rd of December. That will be about cyber security. I'll explain a bit more about that. That'll be a special 1 hour. It will not be recorded, and I can explain a bit later why that is. But we've got booked all the way through to the 3rd of December, and I'll tell you about that at the very end. But thank you very much for joining us. Tuffy Aron, Raphael Aron, let's spotlight you. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you, Ronnie, for the opportunity.
Thank you. This, ladies and gentlemen, you know that this is the point where I ask the really tough questions, the penetrating questions, and let's kick it off straight away with one of the tough questions. Raphael Aron, is it true, yes or no, that in fact you're also known as Tuffy Aron?
This is correct.
Right, okay, well there you go, ladies and gentlemen, you have the tough questions there. So if it's okay, I'll call you Tuffy. That's about as tough as they get, but I'll call you Tuffy from now for the rest of the interview, if that's okay. First thing up, I noticed the topic was called Deradicalisation of Islamists. Is there a difference between Islamists and Muslims?
I've lost you.
Oh, sorry. Can you all hear me?
Now I can.
Yes, okay.
Something happened. Okay.
So is there a difference between Islamists and Muslims?
Look, technically, it's a semantic issue, but when we talk about Muslims, we talk about a faith. When we talk about Islamists, we tend to associate that with something more political and often more radical. I'm not sure if that's correct, but that's certainly in the vernacular. That when we talk about Islamist movements, they're usually referred to as something of a more radical, extreme nature as compared to Muslim movements. You do hear the expression about a Muslim terrorist, but you usually hear the word Islamist terrorist. So Islamist has sort of taken on a more political, more radical, more extreme, and potentially more dangerous connotation.
Right. So you're not trying to radicalize the average Muslim. Is that what you're saying?
No, not at all. The de-radicalization process is something which is relevant to people who have, by definition, been radicalized, which means that their views have been somewhat changed, altered, and become more extreme. And the idea of de-radicalization is to try and bring them back to something more normative. That's really what it's all about. It's hard work.
Is there a problem of radical Islam or Islamists, if you like, in Australia?
Yeah, I would certainly say that there is an issue over here. It's in small numbers. I think we need to be real. The numbers are small. I would see half a dozen families a year, which are seeking assistance because they're concerned about their kids. I should point out it's they that are coming to see me, not necessarily their children. There are a few issues over here which come into play, and that is people are always told before I see them that if I'm told anything that needs to be reported to the various different authorities or hotlines, then I will do that. And I'm not going to be constrained, from what I have to do in terms of my duty and my responsibility, as a member of this country. And that doesn't usually deter people because their concern about their children's behaviour is often at the higher end of the scale, and therefore, if that's what it takes, they're prepared to go through with that. In fact, I don't recall anybody declining an interview because of my very clear statement that if I'm hearing things that need to be reported, that will be the case.
I've never heard of Judaists or Christianists. Is there a problem of other faith groups being radicalized? To the best of your knowledge?
I think there are. Yeah, I think there are, but I think it's also important to understand that when we talk about radicalization, we also need to keep in mind the mental health side of the equation. People often come and talk to me about the fact that their daughter or their son or their loved one is involved in a cult. And one of the issues that comes up relatively early in the piece is, well, tell me about their mental health, tell me about their background and anything that needs to be said. Because there are lots of people who get into cults in a relatively benign way, and lots of people who get into religion in a rather culty way. And I think if you look around the world, even unfortunately in our own state of Israel, there have been incidents of people that have taken radical action. And I would say that is a reflection not just of their beliefs, but also of their mental health.
Okay, so I actually want to walk through the process with you. Before I do that, how did you get involved in this sort of line of work? You don't look like a Muslim yourself.
No.
You look more Amish, I might say.
I took off my burqa for the purposes of this interview because I did want people to see me. It's always interesting when you see Muslim families and if they come in with their full burqa, and one will come in on Monday morning and the next one will come in on Tuesday, and I'll sort of say, I think I've seen you before. And it's really hard because part of the process of working with people is engagement and looking at them as I'm looking at you now. Seeing people with pretty well nothing visible makes it really hard to engage. You've got no idea what's really going on. You've lost that dimension of contact, eye contact, not much body movement because they're completely covered. So, look, my own background is that I was studying psychology at university, and it was a long time ago. It was in the 70s, and part of that was that we were sent off for placement to various different helplines like Lifeline and so on. And while I was there, I was sort of monitored. We didn't deal with suicide and other serious issues. We dealt with things like, at the time, what it was called social security and accommodation and so on, or people on the street or homeless. But I received two calls came through, which I was privy to. One was from a woman who had not seen her daughter for about 3 years and was convinced that she was in a cult. And the other one was from a man whose wife was at the airport about to depart with his 3 children to India, and he was convinced he wouldn't see them again. And I knew nothing about cults, and there was nothing to look up on the net. It was really it was a very, very closed world as far as access to information is concerned. So I contacted people in America and I started doing some research, and then I did something rather strange. My parents were not exactly excited about it. I decided to try and join some of these organizations and be part of them and hang out in these places. And that was probably a rather unusual
unorthodox approach, yes.
Work. Ronnie and I come from the same sort of ethnic background. It's not the sort of thing that our parents would have been particularly approving of. It was more out of the box for them than it would be for most other parents in our sort of demographic. But I walked away from that absolutely, shocked, inspired, lots of feelings that there's something going on over here, that it is actually possible, and this is the crux, that people's minds can be changed, that people can have their personalities altered. They can walk into an organization as an upstanding citizen and walk away with some very, very strange and potentially dangerous views. And then there was the story at that time, which some may remember and some may not, of Patty Hearst and her indoctrination into an organization called the Symbionese Liberation Army. And there was Jonestown, which shocked the world in 1978. 960 people took their lives, which I would suggest was murder rather than suicide. And then in the 90s, there was Waco and there was Heaven's Gate and all those sort of things. So I became involved. I wrote a couple of books about this, set up an organization called Cult Consulting Australia, and we became quite busy. And what's significant is that people would ask me, but this is a very niche market. Why don't you spend more time on your other area of life, which is dealing with people with addictions? And basically 9/11, in 2001, everything changed. At the time, Bush called Al-Qaeda a cult, and And suddenly people are asking questions, how is it possible for people coming from a middle-class background, people who have a college education, people who have no issues in terms of financial support, to turn themselves into murderers? There were 20 people who hijacked, well, there were 19. There were meant to be 20 people who were hijacking those planes. One missed the plane. A guy called Mohammed Atta, who's sitting in prison. But everybody else came from an absolutely flawless background. There was no criminal history on the part of any of them, no convictions. And the same has happened, time and time again. The London bombings were another example of people who came from, in that situation, upper-class backgrounds, and had resorted to terrorist activity. And so that all of those things, I suppose, fed into the fact that mind control is not just about cults. It's a phenomenon which is affecting society, and affecting society in a big way. So our work changed from being perhaps a bit niche in terms of the cult environment into the larger world of radicalisation and terrorism.
So, Tuffy, who commissions you?
That's a really interesting question. So we're basically a community organisation with a board and a not-for-profit organisation. I must say that I've got a lot of autonomy in terms of the work that we do, because I'm the one who supposed heads it all up. But I have a group of people that work with me. Most of the people that work with me are former cult members who are feeling they need to give something back into the community. I work closely with the police. Sort of interesting when it comes to it's hard to say you work with intelligence agencies, because in the old days when I used to call up and ASIO or any of those groups with information which I thought was important, I used to wait for the phone call back in order to know, well, what happened to the guy that I talked about? Well, I learned very quickly there's no phone calls back at all. It's a one-way relationship, and you can give them an enormous amount of information, and it can be particularly useful and may end up with arrests and all sorts of things, but the only way you're going to find out about it is reading in the media. It is the way it works, and I respect that, and I honour that, and it's an important part of the network.
So you mentioned before parents have come to you, but do you get police or a judge doing a diversion programs referring someone to you? How does that work?
Yeah, we work. There's lots of questions here, but lots of answers. Yes, we work very closely with the police. I work very, very closely with the courts. It's something I'm doing pretty well on a regular basis. I'm in court every week or two. Now it's all by Zoom. But at the same time, there's a huge amount of work to be done, because, look, in the sort of culty sort of situation, the most typical situation, apart from with their criminal charges, which are rare, because most cults just operate just under the radar, and there aren't many criminal charges which are being laid. But the typical situation is a family court environment where there was a mother and a father in a cult. They had a child. Either parent left the cult, and the one who's out of the cult is now seeking orders to prevent the one who's in the cult from bringing their child into the precincts of that organisation. And I'm called in as an expert witness in order to be able to advise the court as to what this is really all about. And it's not a situation of an organisation such as the Quakers or the Flat Earth Society. It's an organisation which is going to have a deleterious effect on the upbringing and social environment of that child. So, and in relation to other matters, yeah, the police are good. We work with police quite regularly. And they're also willing to learn and willing to understand. A lot of them are young constables who haven't really got an understanding of what's going on in this area. And they're willing to listen to somebody else. So these networks are really essential to the work that we do.
Right. Now, previously, a few minutes ago, you mentioned that sometimes parents will refer their child, I don't know if it's a son or a daughter, I don't know if it makes a difference, to you, saying that they seem to become radicalised, but the parent knows that you may actually refer this on to ASIO or police.
Okay.
Aren't they in two minds about coming to you?
The parents, first of all, as I said right in the beginning, most of the people that I'm dealing with, a very large majority of families and parents rather than the kids themselves. The kids that I deal with are the kids that have exited that environment and want help in order to understand how they could have got in there. Is there something about their mental health which needs assessment? How do they make sense of the fact that while they were there, they recruited others and now they're out and the other ones are still in there, which is a very typical question. And using the sort of Viktor Frankl model, trying to understand how to find meaning in the experience that they've had, which I find particularly enlightening. In fact, of all the work that I do in this area, the most satisfying work is not trying to run an intervention or extract somebody from a cult, which can be very exciting and very colourful. The most meaningful work for me is working with people who've been there, and they've been part of Al-Qaeda, they've been part of ISIS, and they want to understand now what they did and how they can get their lives back together, and whether they need to do anything in relation to those that have been recruited under their watch. So most of the people that I deal with are either parents who are seeking assistance for their children, or children who've exited and are no longer there. The ones who are there are not the sort of people that frequent my office, but the parents, as I said, are made aware right in the beginning that if they're going to tell me something about their children, so for example, that they've just applied for a new passport, or they've been on the phone with a travel agent and they seem to be looking up airline tickets to Turkey on the way to Syria or something like that, that is the sort of information which is going to need to be passed on. But as I said, I do not recall a situation where a parent actually said thank you, but no thank you, if that's what you need to do.
And Tuffy, during COVID, this pretty much most of 2020, have you had more or less or the same number of cases?
In relation to the cult area, and again, we haven't talked much about that, but in relation to the cult area and what's going on with lots of organisations operating around Australia and around the world, one which received a huge amount of publicity recently, for those who would have watched or looked at it, was an organisation called Nexium in America, where a fellow was running a sex cult. Unfortunately, he had caught into his web a lot of very prominent Jewish people, in particular from the famous Bronfman family, one of whom is now in jail for many, many years. That caught the attention of the media, but also of many people looking at that sort of information. So there's a lot going on. Look, the cults thrived under COVID because it was another sign that the world's really coming to an end. So they did well. They used it as an opportunity to be able to extend their reach and their platform. Just parenthetically, it's interesting how there's sort of a theory that when people join a cult which is going to spell the end of the world at some point, and then it doesn't happen, you sort of expect that the cult begins to crumble. And there are cults that seem to be doing really well, even though they predicted the end of the world for years and on many occasions. And the reason why they survive is because the cult leader actually convinces his membership that he saved the world from ending. It actually was going to end, and he managed to intervene, and therefore we're all still here. So he created the myth.
Yeah.
He exploded the myth, and we're all still here. And I prefer not to mention particular names, but there are quite a few, shall we say, Christian or fundamentalist organizations that are doing just that. And as I said, because legally they're really on the right side of the law, they seem to get away with what they're doing. But organizations that, for example, disfellow people, disenfranchise them from their families, exclude them from any further family involvement because they've left. The shunning concept, which is well known among certain groups, is a huge source of concern for me. What it means for a young man or young woman who's come to the conclusion that this is a cult to walk away, not just from the organization as a structure, but from the parents, the brothers, the sisters, the grandparents. It's really, really hard work. And
now, Tuffy, are you ever working with subjects who are a bit resistant to your intervention, or are they all happy to cooperate?
No, they're not. None of them are happy to cooperate. Not at all. The most difficult area of this work is to be able to establish a link with people who see myself and others as a threat. And not only that, but they've also been pretty well programmed to believe that the evil Satan out there is out to get you and you've got to resist it. And that actually is personally a challenge for me, because before the net came on, I was able to do much more, but unfortunately now it just takes a press of a key and they see that that's me, and I'm obviously an anti-cult guy and they don't want to talk to me. So I'm often not the frontline person, but essentially the idea of getting somebody out of a cult is fraught with risk and danger in terms of success. It's difficult, but the general thrust of it is to try and establish a relationship with that individual outside the organization and to nurture that relationship and to try and show that there is life outside that organization. The other thing is that part of the process is that we all believe that everybody who joins a cult still retains what we would call their pre-cult personality. And what we try to do is revive that, show them videos of themselves with their girlfriends, with their motorbikes, with their family. That becomes far more difficult where somebody's been born into a cult and there's never been a pre-cult personality. A little bit like somebody who, God forbid, is born blind. It's a far more difficult challenge than someone who saw even just for a few years of their life. It's a totally different experience. So in the area of cult rescue or cult intervention, somebody who's been born into an environment who doesn't know about anything else, it's far more difficult because you've got nothing to reflect on as a context. But once you've established that rapport, which takes a lot of work, the rest of it is not all that difficult to be able to begin to show them what this has been and what it's all about and the alternatives that they have. A lot of people don't leave cults because they're simply frightened to do so.
So I want to pick up on probably two things straight away. You mentioned fraught with danger. Have you ever felt in danger in the process? Can you share a story?
I could, but you'd have to turn the recording off.
So, which we could do, by the way, if that's what you want.
I could tell some very hairy stories of where I've had to have police protection, and that's been done on a number of occasions. There's one story which is a long one. It's actually covered.
Would you like me to pause the recording, by the way?
The story is a long story, and we probably won't have the opportunity to get through it. It'll take us at least 10 minutes to get through the story.
Yeah.
I have published a couple of books, and one of them I have here. It's called, you see that? Cults Too Good to Be True.
Yes.
It does cover some of the stories, but there have been situations where, I suppose, had I been in my office and had I taken a phone call, and had I accompanied the person who wanted to be reunited with a child on the basis of an invitation to do so, and was then killed, that had I been present at that encounter or that meeting with a child, I don't know if I'd be here to tell my story. So there have been, this is a particular story where, as I said, somebody had been looking for their child for a very long time, had been working with me, eventually was given an invitation by the child to be able to come and see them at a particular location. The person contacted me and they wanted to talk to me about it. I was not in the office at the time, and they then did what they would have done, they wanted to do, and they went to that location and they were shot and they were killed. And prior to that, the mother, the woman who was killed, had actually called my office and she called me Raphael, and she said, "Raphael, I want to ask you two questions. I've got a letter from my daughter who wants to see me. No, two questions. Should I go and see her? And secondly, as you've accompanied me until now and everything we've done, will you come with me?" Had I been in the office, and I've thought about this many, many times, I probably would have said yes to both questions. I wouldn't have wanted her to go by herself. I would have felt a sense of responsibility to accompany her. But the end was very grisly and very terrible. So that particular organization has been on my screen for a long time. And about a year later, I was asked to be involved with someone who also had a member of their family there. And I had police protection all the way through. In fact, all the way, it was in Tasmania, all the way from here to Hobart and back. I was being looked after. So it's not a common occurrence, but it is an area of concern which comes up every so often.
Right. Forgive my naivete, but I always thought cults were a thing of the 70s and 80s. We're now in the 2020s. Have we still got an issue of cults?
Yeah, well, that's the point, that a lot of people, I get this question very, very often, that well, 70s, 80s and 90s, they certainly were there. I can tell you now that I would spend probably out of a week of 6 working days, at least a day and a half, working with people who belong to cults, which some of them receive, prominent publicity, some of them don't. You've also got a whole lot of personal development groups operating, which again, in my mind, are very, very culty. There are a lot of very Christian fundamentalist groups, Pentecostal groups, which I have some serious concerns about. No, if there was the opportunity, shall we say, an off-air discussion, it would be not difficult to be able to talk about some of the groups that are operating here in Australia and are operating overseas also. We also have an increase more recently of something else, which is a topic of its own, and that's the satanic cults, which many people think are a fiction rather than a reality. I know otherwise. They're extremely difficult to work with, and the degree of horror and destruction that they sort of create for the membership is unbelievable.
Now, Tuffy, I must admit, probably all the viewers understand this, but I'm a bit confused about the definition of a cult. We start off by talking about Muslim fundamentalists, I suppose. You've mentioned Christian fundamentalists. I'm not intending to be rude or cheeky, but I'm going to ask you, are you a member of a Hasidic group?
Hasidic cult.
Well, actually, I was going to get onto that because I believe, I've been told, that some members of the Chabad group, maybe many, I don't know, believe that their Rebbe is still alive. They have photos of their Rebbe in the baby's crib. They still rely on the Rebbe, I believe has passed since, but I don't know, but they still rely on the Rebbe to supply answers. How do we define a cult?
Okay, it's a really good question, and I'll probably go one step further and say no presentation is complete without the question.
Okay, fair enough.
I remember I was speaking in Sydney many years ago to a group at a Shule, and at the end of it, one of the very prominent members of the Shule got up and he said, "Look, I hear everything you're saying about cults, and I'm really sorry to say that I've got grandchildren who both parents are Baalei Teshuva and not religious, and those kids don't have the internet, and they're going to get married by arrangement. They're probably going to go to university. They're going to go and evangelize the Chabad faith across the world. I mean, is that any different from a cult?" And I felt like falling through the floor. I thought I'd done a really good job, given a really good talk. Yeah. And this guy pulled the carpet out of my feet. It was awful. And then he turned around with a big smile and he said, "I want to tell you something, because if there was ever a cult I want my grandchildren to belong to, it's that one."
Very good.
He said, "Because I've got other family members who've got grandchildren who are on the streets, and I've got other grandchildren who are in other places, and so they're in the right place." Look, the answer is, it's a really good question. I've actually written a book on it. It hasn't been published yet. It's called Is Chabad a Cult? That is a working title. It'll probably have something more colorful when it comes out. Essentially, there's lots of things we can say about cults in relation to, the fact that they denigrate women, the fact that they, amass enormous material wealth for leaders who talk about the lies of poverty and all that sort of stuff. And I think that there's lots of things to be said. To answer you with a couple of points, the essential issue of a cult is personality change. People become different. They're no longer who they were. Let's forget about Chabad just for 1 minute and talk generally. People who become, shall we say, more religious may perhaps become a little more serious about life, may become a little more orderly in their life, but they still are the same people. They've got the same sense of humor. They've still got their same interests in terms of, some sort of worldly connection. In most situations, there are a few that don't. They retain relationships with their loved ones, even if they're not religious. Were they to leave the religion, they're not going to be shunned by their family and sent away. The essential characteristic of the cult is the personality change. So when people come and talk to me about the fact that children are in cults, I ask them about that. I say, "Tell me about your child's personality today, and tell me about your child's personality before they join." I don't believe that people who become religious, and I don't believe people who join Chabad change their personalities. They are still involved in the world, in the world of commerce, in the world of business, in the world of education, doing good things. So I think that really is perhaps the demarcation line. On the other hand, there are people who belong to all sorts of different faiths, and we don't need to look only at Chabad. You can look at other Chassidim in Israel, whose behavior is quite radical and quite extreme. I mean, there's the group in very supposedly religious Jews in Mea Shearim who support the Iranian regime. So we need to be able to differentiate between mainstream and others. In the main, I believe that the issue of personality change is really the criteria by which we measure cult involvement. Coming back to Chabad, and I will certainly acknowledge the statements that you were making in relation to various people's behavior, but I think one of the most important, there are a number of important things to recognize. Cults generally denigrate women. If you want to talk about Chabad, I will say with some degree of pride that the Lubavitcher Rebbe did, if anything, validate women to a point well beyond all that's been done by any others. To sort of take the huge shul that he has in Brooklyn and fill it up with women and talk to them, to see women in private audiences, to talk about the purpose and spirituality of a woman is a complete departure of what cults are all about. Cults amass extreme wealth for the leadership. One could hardly say so in relation to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Cults often regard themselves as being, or the leadership, as exempt from the general practices which are imposed upon their following. I mean, as we know, the Lubavitcher Rebbe and many others were meticulous in their observance of Torah and mitzvah. So, look, I'm just giving you a few thoughts. Yeah. It's an important question, and I do acknowledge the fact that there is often an element of radical behaviour which does borderline cult sort of stuff. But I think we need to differentiate that from the mainstream, and it's usually the more borderline stuff which attracts attention and gets the it gets the media excited. But I think across the board, there's certainly a much greater variance of behaviour and the independence of thought. That's not to speak about the fact that cult libraries are made up of cult books, and that's really what you see in their libraries. If you go to these organisations, that's all they have. Behind me, I have a small section of our library. It covers everything. There's a certain breadth of knowledge and understanding as to who we are. I mean, we can pay tribute, if I'm allowed to at this time, to Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, and a man who had a very close connection with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and someone from whom he drew inspiration, and probably his entire life was on some level based on that. It's actually quite strange. I'll say this, the world is full of all sorts of anomalies. When I wrote this book, I decided I needed some endorsements. So I got 3 endorsements for my book. One from the Honourable Zalman Cohen, the other one from, at the time, Professor John Sachs, and the other one from George Pell. Well, only one has survived.
Yeah. Very interesting observation.
I have to say that connection. There's a connection.
Oh, yes.
I got to George Pell through Rabbi Lubovsky.
Oh, right. St. Kilda Shule, there you go.
Right.
Now, Tuffy, our time is almost up. Just a quick question about success and failure. Is it fair to assume that you don't always have a success?
I think it's fair to assume that, but I think we're also a little bit skewed in our statistics because we only take on cases where there's a reasonable chance of a positive outcome. Right. Having said that, it's also really important to understand that whoever we work with, we need to make sure the door is kept open for future work. We can't come in guns blazing and have the person never wanting to talk to us again. We've got to come in with a reasonably, considered lateral approach and make it meaningful so that the door is open. Often what we do is we plant ideas in people's minds about what cults are all about, and it takes them to get back to be able to see the reality of our arguments. So, for example, we'll tell somebody that in the group you belong to, you're not allowed to ask any questions, completely forbidden, you're gagged. Oh, that's not really true. We ask questions. Go back to the group a week later and someone puts up their hand and wants to ask a question and is told, no, you can't ask that question. You have to listen and you have to absorb our message. And if you're asking that question, it shows you haven't been here long enough. So you've sort of created a level of doubt which often is realized only later on. And we believe that that's an important part of our work.
And how long does it take to complete a process?
To get somebody out of an organization, usually our work in preparing for that can take between 3 and 6 months. There is an argument which I don't follow, that the amount of time that's required for people to get back into normality is matched by the time they were in the cult. So if you're in the cult for 5 years, you need to be in some sort of ongoing work for 5 years. I don't actually believe that. I think that it just depends on the individual. But as I said, the most fulfilling area of work is post, what we call post-cult exit counseling, where you work with people very closely. I run sessions for people over a period of literally 2 days, 2 full days, and finding meaning in their experience. And cults can, I'll just finish with one quick note.
Sure.
Cults can also have a positive impact on people's lives. I'll tell you a very quick story of a woman who I know, who I have been working with for several years, who was brought up in a very strict Catholic family, and she found that she had no room to move, no room to question. But she accepted that control as part of life. She then got into a very abusive relationship where she was hounded and abused for several years, but had been brought up in an environment of control. This was an extension. She then got involved in a cult, which was extremely controlling, at which point she came in contact with me. She had left the cult because that cult was the organization that brought home the fact that she's not free, that she needs to find herself. And she's an incredibly accomplished woman. She's gone on to do great things. But had she not gone into that group, she would never have had that click in her own mind, her own brain, that I have been controlled from birth. That was the thing that did it, was the, as we say in our holy tongue, the makaba patish. It was it was that which brought about the final sort of blow. I have been a victim. I have been a subject, a slave for most of my life. And if not for that, she'd probably still be here.
Well, thank you very much. We've really done our time. I can see some questions have popped up and so on. Adrian is one of our medicos, but some questions popped up. Unfortunately, we've done our time. I wanted to say thank you very much, Tuffy Aron, for really enlightening me, at least, on the work you do, and wish you much success. And you've certainly clarified a few things for me. So thank you very, very much.
Happy to be back at another time.
I can see some comments have come up saying we want him back. So we'll see what we can organise. Before we go, and you did a beautiful segue, by the way, Tuffy, into tonight. Tonight there will be yet another communal tribute to Rabbi Lord
Is it Lord Rabbi or Rabbi Lord?
Sorry?
Is it Lord Rabbi or Rabbi Lord?
It's actually so good question. It's Rabbi Lord. Normally a religious prenominal precedes any other prenominals.
You're just Rabbi, right, Ronnie?
I'm just Rabbi, and Rabbi Nochschlepper. I've got the extra time, Nochschlepper. But Rabbi comes first. So tonight at 8 o'clock is another communal tribute. You'll find it, by the way, on tinyurl.com/Rabbi Lord Sachs. But that means our Yad Vashem, we're in the middle, though some of you are participating in a 10-week program with Yad Vashem. It's not still too late to sign up, but we've already done 4 out of those weeks. That 8 o'clock class will be 7 p.m. tonight. So just letting you know that the Yad Vashem class live from Israel will be 7 p.m. If you want more information, maybe type into the chat now your email address, and I can certainly provide you with information. So tonight there are those 2 things on. Sunday night, St. Kilda Shule are running a live interview with Adam Schwab, who's the founder of Luxury Escapes. It'll be interesting to hear what he's got to say about how the COVID world has changed his line of business. The coming week's programs for Thursday Lunch Club are as exciting as today. Next week, we have a real estate agent, Marshall Rushford. He'll be giving us simple tips for making your home look stunning. You don't have to sell your home. I'm sure he'd love if you did, but you don't have to sell your home. He'll tell you how to live in a home that looks absolutely stunning. Simple tips, low-cost tips. The following week, we have from Finder.com, Graham Cook is the International Insights Manager. He'll be speaking about how to find the best savings online. Don't miss that. But the one after that, on the 3rd of December, is with an information security manager from Commonwealth Bank. Theo Anton will be speaking about cybersecurity. Could you be the next victim? It will be an hour-long special, and he'll be speaking about the sorts of traps that any of us might fall into it's a must watch. And the only other thing I should mention is that St Kilda Shule and ZDVO, used to be called Bet Lochem, will be doing a live broadcast from Israel on the 29th, Sunday the 29th of November. 29th of November, Tuffy, you'll probably recall, was the Haftet B'November, was in fact the date that the UN declared the State of Israel in 1947. To commemorate that, St Kilda Shule and ZDVO do a live broadcast, an interview live from Israel with two disabled veterans, a male and a female, both with fascinating stories. If you're not sure about all these events, you must get our newsletter. Just type in your email address into the chat and I'll try to make sure that you get our newsletter. With that, I thank you again, Tuffy, and I thank you all for participating again today. Wishing you all the very best, and may all your news be good news. Stay safe until we meet again next week. Thank you very, very much.
Ronnie, take care. Bye.
Thank you.